Hello, everyone. This is my first attempt at creating some mapping related content. For those who don't know me, I'll start with a quick introduction. My name is White, or Dash White. I'm a OSU nomination and assessment team member, NAT, former BN, current organizer and mentor within the community mentorship program. I do some mapping contests and things like that. The most recent one being the Vocaloid mapping contest, number 3. At the time of this recording, it has just completed its first phase. So that's been quite the journey. What else? Oh, I'm also a contest committee member at this time, so I choose or vote on what contests get official tournament support. And yeah. Anyway, point being that I've seen a lot of maps, and I've been mapping for a fair while. I'm a ranked mapper, and I could map more, but I tend to put my priorities elsewhere. So I think that I have something to say, or something that really a lot of people could value from, a lot of aspiring and even current mappers who want to potentially expand the depth of their maps. Now, you clicking on this video, you've seen the title, right? You have the general, probably, gist of where I'm taking this. But in my opinion, I think that this map is one of the most emotionally powerful and evocative maps in OSU, period. I guess within standard. I don't know the other game modes. What I think is so incredible is that this really highlights the whole emotional response that Charles 445 preached about and talked about on his little podcast. You can find that on his user page. Charles 445 theorized that there is a physical response as to what the players are actually forced to do, and that there's an emotional response as to what the map actually makes you feel, what choices the mapper makes that create an actual feeling, like tension or unease or distress or discomfort or disgust, these kinds of raw feelings that a map can actually create. And I think this map does a fantastic job of, probably the best of any map that I've ever seen at doing exactly that, at creating these feelings. And they do it in a way that represents the song so perfectly, and they represent it in a way that it's very clear as to what the mapper's vision for it is. And that to me is the best kind of map. It's the most fulfilling to look at and to play, is when you get to really get a sense, you get into the mind of the mapper. What are they feeling when they listen to this song? And the tricky thing with stuff like that is that it's very subjective. If that vision resonates with you, then it's going to be the best map ever for you, right? To me, this map is, this is my favorite map in the game because I love the song and I love the vision, and I think the vision, what the map does, represents the song so flawlessly, right? In such a raw, meaningful way. That's not going to be the case for everyone, and that is okay. However, I think there's a lot of techniques that the mapper uses in this map, and there's a lot of depth in those techniques that can be useful to any mapper trying to apply or improve their mapping, right? So you can take a lot of these techniques and apply it into your own map and hopefully create much more engaging, deep experiences, experiential kind of maps, rather than just I click the circle and get a score, right? So if that's not your goal, if you have no interest whatsoever in improving your maps, hey, click off this video. I don't care. This isn't for you. But for those who really want to create the better maps, I think that you'll find value. And if you're not even a mapper at all, right, you may even find value in seeing an analysis of some of the techniques that mappers use. That being said, this map is closer to you by Undead Capulet, a very notorious or infamous mapper. This is one of their later maps, and it's actually in their own vision and own mind, one of, if not their best map. And in many people's case, in many people's mind, this is their best map, including my own mind. So a map like this is really best experienced by playing it. It is extremely, extremely oriented around the player experience and how that, and creating those feelings when you play it. Looking at the editor for this is doesn't quite do it justice, right? You know, when I explain it, it will hopefully make some sense, but it will never match the experience of playing it. A lot of these things you should notice subconsciously. A lot of these things other mappers do, either subconsciously or consciously, but this map kind of ties it all together. And there's other concepts that I'll introduce as well, like musical structure and things like that, that I learned and have applied from my experience with this map. Like, this map has single-handedly been the most influential on my own mapping of any map in the game, bar none. It is just, I use so many of the techniques that I've seen in this map and understood from this map in my own mapping. Maybe not one-to-one, maybe not directly, but I think that a lot of the basic concepts are applicable anywhere. So I won't bore you by playing through this map. Well, I guess I probably should, because I'm sure there's a lot of you that are going to be lazy and not going to bother opening up the editor for this video. So I'll go ahead and test play it. I'll give it a timestamp or whatever. You can skip, 4 minutes or whatever into the future to skip this. So I'll go ahead and have the test player. Here's the map. So you can go ahead and watch. Yeah. All right, welcome back. Um, so as you saw, right, as like a high summary, high overarching view, right, is that the map is on the surface extremely ugly, right? Um, I actually recently applied for the Spotlights team, like a position there, and my application was denied because I sent this in, and they said that this map was they didn't say this to my face, right? But apparently, one of the reasons that they rejected my application was um, that this map they thought was bad, right? So on the surface, it does look ugly, and actually, that's one of the reasons I love this map so much is that if you can get past that, it's so rewarding, right? And I actually use this map as like a fun challenge or puzzle for my students that I'm teaching or my mentees that I'm teaching how to effectively mentor or mod maps is how well can we get past that surface into the actual meat and potatoes, right, of what the mapper in map is trying to do, right, and accomplish. And a lot of my mentor applicants struggle with dissecting this map and getting past that surface. So we're gonna go into that. So yeah, on the surface, it's ugly as heck, right? And that is by design. And ultimately, when you played it or when you watched it, hopefully you got a sort of sense of, in general, the sense of distress or unease, discomfort. Maybe any of those, maybe some of those words or things like that apply to some of the feelings that hopefully you felt or potentially you felt during the map, right? And if you didn't feel any of that, then maybe this map isn't for you, right? But again, it's not for everyone. Feeling emotional type of things are not going to be for everyone, ultimately, right? And that's okay. That's okay, right? Not everyone finds, you know, X insert romance, right? Anime, right? You know, think of like Clanad, right? Very well regarded anime for having an extreme emotional impact. Some people don't like it, right? Didn't work for them, and ultimately that's a completely respectable. Well, I don't know if I would say respectable, but because Planet is really good. But it's kind of like what can you do, right? It is what it is. So anyway, I think there's other things that you'll get value in from watching this beyond that. So the chaoticness of the visuals is a huge aesthetic component, and it is done intentionally. The specific choices that they make to create that chaotic aesthetic, like the specific slider shapes, are not the focus, right? They're fairly random, actually, a lot of those specific shapes that they use. And one that helps to serve the purpose of creating that chaos, the chaos of the map and the sort of discomfort that you would feel. But really, the shapes are just kind of stolen from maps that they were inspired by, you know, particularly Chinese mappers. So don't pay attention to the specific shape. Right? It's not relevant that it has two red anchors versus one, for example. The way that they use the shapes is somewhat relevant, right? They tend to be used relatively consistently throughout. Okay. So get that out of the way now. So we'll skip to where there's the first objects, and we'll kind of skim through here. This is a relatively calm section, right? So long held sliders under mapped, so there's not it's not there's not like they're not spamming sliders, not spamming active stuff. There's a lot of these held sliders, a lot of these repeats. It keeps the intensity and the clicking very low, right? So that you contrast really nicely when the drum layer comes in, and you know now you have this drum that's kind of chaotic. It's an active, it's intense, very expressive. This drum, so then you have this a lot more jumps, you have a lot more active rhythms, that kind of thing. So it contrasts extremely powerfully. Now we have this part, which contrasts even more from that previous part, where, you know, instead of having this free spacing, lots of big jumps, lots of sliders, that kind of thing, we have just circles, right? It's very, very sparsely rhythmed, very low spacing, and it's the movement is fairly constant, right? It's not zigzaggy, it's not jagged, it's fairly smooth, right? With some like small nuances in there, right? Like maybe you'll have, a slight stopping effect, especially with these like bigger stacks. But for the most part, you're kind of just moving along with very low spacing. And it's sort of meandering its way around the playfield. That's a big word that I like to use for this map. It really feels like it's sort of meandering here, right? There's not really a specific objective that it feels like you have when you're aiming here, when you're moving. But what you are doing is you're moving down the playfield. You're sort of staying relatively in the center of the playfield, and you're moving down the playfield. And at this point, you've reached the bottom of the playfield. You can't go down anymore. So in this case, the map actually turns in on itself, right? It's no longer moving down. It's just moving right across where it was before. And this is done intentionally. This is sort of foreshadowing what's coming later. It's creating this clutter, right? It's very cluttered here. But it's not so bad because it's not a super long, drawn out sort of clutter. It's sort of just hinting at that. So here, the song changes, the drums change, the vocals sort of open up. There's this guitar. So the spacing increases. You move away from that clutteredness at the bottom of the screen. It's a lot more free. Instead of moving down the center of the playfield in a constrained manner, now we're moving freely around the outside for the most part. So it's much more free. Now, with regard to playfield usage, right? Playfield usage is a huge emphasis point within this map, and they use it extremely effectively, where, smaller movements, more smoothly moving around the playfield in contrasting with going through the center, cross-screen chaos, right? It's like the sort of the main dynamic within or the contrast between the chorus and the verse, right? Which, if you haven't looked at the map, or if you did look at the map because I showed it to you, that's one of the main contrasting elements. Now, Pishy has a video on playfield usage, and one of the things that he says in that video is that mappers, or that he believes, maybe not all mappers, but he believes that the center of the playfield is the most impactful, right? It's the most visually prominent. It's the focal point of the map. It is sort of the most visually striking, whatever you want, right? Undead Capulet disagrees with that idea, right? And I think the idea makes perfect sense, what Pishy is saying. Perfect sense. I'm not saying he's wrong, actually. I oftentimes very much so use the center of the playfield myself when I'm creating a focal point or an emphasis point with just the playfield. However, Undead Capulet believes that the edges, the corners of the playfield, specifically not the edges, but the corners, the things furthest from the center are the most visually or the most impactful, right? The most emphasized places on the playfield. And the reason is that it's the furthest from your natural resting place, right? Your natural resting place is looking dead center at your screen with your mouse in the center, right? If you're placing an object way off in the corner, that's the furthest from that. So it has a ton of emphasis because it stands out so much. And so that's what you're going to see a lot, is that these points of emphasis are going to start and end in the corners of the playfield. So in this case, instead of moving around the outside of the playfield, we're coming down to the corner and we're moving up diagonally, which is a very different sort of playfield movement compared to what the rest of the map has used so far. So this phrase here stands out significantly, and it stands out purposefully because this is a transition phrase, right? It transitions us into the next part of the song. So it's a very nice sort of divider, if you will, leading into the next thing. So as it moves up the playfield. And it also fits, of course, the rising pitch of the singer. So you got triple, you got this burst, so lots of movement created here, and then you have the rhythm density getting cut in half, right? So lots of movement with this burst, and then very little movement with this triple, or this triplet, whatever you want to call it. And then you have a ton of movement going into like the jump, and then that follows through into the slider. So the kick slider creates a ton of energy. That energy is kept through the jump, which emphasizes this whole held vocal that you're hearing right here. All right, so in the first chorus here, we have jump, kick slider, into slider, right? And this is used consistently across the difficulty. Specifically, it is used in the first measure of, and each of the first measures, effectively, usually. So each of these first measures, each of these, it uses this kick slider into a longer held slider idea, right? So, thinking about song structure, right? We have, basic song structure here on a 4/4 time signature. Every measure is made up of 4 beats. And of course, each beat can be divided into sub beats, right? A quarter beat, half beat, third beat, whatever it is, right? But what a lot of people don't realize is that there's a bigger idea than just a measure, right? And a measure is going to be white tick to white tick, or red tick to red tick, or so on and so forth. But there's a bigger idea, and these are the concept of, or I take it back. Sorry, a beat is white tick to white tick, red tick to red tick. So I misspoke there. The measure is going to be a big white tick to big white tick, right? So these are 4 beats specifically, and you can't mix them up. Then there's a important concept that you may have learned about when you were elementary school and learning some basic music theory. And it's the idea of this A-B-A-B song structure, or A-B-A-C song structure. The idea is that each measure or beats within measures, they sort of pair up. They oftentimes repeat in certain designated spots. Typically with a more traditional song like J-rock, J-pop, they use an A-B-A-C song structure, where the first measure is one thing, and then there's something different, and then it repeats the first measure, right? And then there's going to be something different again after that, and that third thing, that C, is going to transition you into the next phrase, the next hypermeasure, right? The hypermeasure concept is not one that is oftentimes used, or oftentimes, a lot of people don't really use that term because it's not clear cut like a measure is. A measure is 4 beats on a 4/4 time signature. It's how time signatures are defined. However, hypermeasures are a little bit more vague. Typically, on a 4/4 time signature, they're going to be every 4 measures, right? A hypermeasure is every 4 measures. That makes sense. But in some cases, they may not be, depending on the song, and that's kind of why they're less used, that terminology. But it is a real music term. You can look it up if you'd like. But the idea is that it sort of describes these larger musical phrases. Now, Undead Capulet is very well aware of this concept. That's actually who I learned it from. And they use it very heavily. So, like we talked about, each measure uses this big kick slider jump. What you'll notice is that the measure B and the measure C are different from measure A and A, right? Or the 2 A's. So here's measure A, right? The first measure. Okay, so there's that. And then there's measure B. And like measure B, we have a slight change, right? Now, instead of the other things, we're doing these circles that are evenly spaced. And these ones are more for the vocals, really, probably, than anything, which is a bit of a shift from the overall approach in this song, which is very, very drum focused. The actual rhythm choice heavily prioritizes the drums over anything else, and they use other choices like spacing and movement and slider velocity and things like that to represent other aspects like the vocals and the overall intensity and the guitars and things like that. But the actual rhythm choices themselves are really specifically trying to map the drums in the vast majority of the song. And that's a very important aspect to Undead Capulets mapping in general. So this is a fairly substantial paradigm change in this B. And it transitions us back into the next A, which of course then uses the big kick slider jump and slider and all that. A, we had these parallel sliders, right? So the actual shape, like I said, is not super important, but the actual way that they're used, hey, it's pretty clear that these are some amount of parallel isms, going on right here. Then we have the third measure, which is so that was the third measure. Sorry. Now we're on the fourth measure, and this is the C. Right? The C is going to be probably usually oftentimes similar to the B, but not always, right? So in this case, instead of using just circles, now we're using kick sliders. So this transitions us really nicely into our second hypermeasure. So that C, like I said, is really important, right? I really emphasize that C measure because it is oftentimes serving as a transition phrase into the next musical idea or the next, in this case, hypermeasure, right? So really pay attention to those transition phrases in the song because that justifies, in very many cases, significant changes within your mapping to represent that, right? And this is how I incorporate song structure into my own mapping to justify these changes. So anyway, we're on the second hypermeasure. And hypermeasures also conform to this idea of A-B-A-C song structure, right? So this B hypermeasure is going to be a bit different from the first one, okay? So we had this big slider, right? That wasn't in the first one, as one example. But the overall approach in the second hypermeasure is fairly close to the first one, right? So this is that A, if you will. Pretty similar overall to the A, right? You had the parallel sliders of the first hypermeasure. So there's a lot of repetition of ideas. The shapes, again, are fairly random, right? That's okay. The core concepts are not. Again, we have this idea of low space circles. I think it's slightly more space than the first one. Whatever. Kick slider jumps. So now we are in... which one we are in now? I believe that this is measure... this is the B, so transition. This is the repeat of the A, so the third measure of the second hypermeasure. And then... at some point here... right here, we transition into our fourth measure of the second hypermeasure of the chorus, right? And the second, or the fourth measure, like we talked about, is that C, right? It's going to be different from the first ones. The second hypermeasure is going to be a little different from the first C of the first hypermeasure, right? So we have big slider, fast slider, slow slider, right? And that contrasts really heavily with this massive cross-screen 1/4 stream, right? Remember how I talked about that earlier, that this idea of corners being more emphasized, right? This cuts through the entire map and divides the screen. It is a really, really powerful symbolic representation of we are cutting this chorus in half, right? It is a really, really meaningful transition into the next segment, the next half of the chorus, right? And it does signal significant changes, right? And so let's take a look what changes. All right. You should have already noticed it. And you may not be able to say exactly what changed, but you should feel what changed. And in the song, what changed was it became a lot more intense. What became more intense? Why did it become more intense in terms of feeling? It's because there's like in this background, there's this screaming added, like this vocal that's just like going off. It's just screaming, right? That was not in the first part of the map. And so even though we're in the third hypermeasure of the chorus, right? And choruses are usually 4 hypermeasures because it's, when you're in a 4/4 time signature, most of these things end up grouped into 4s. So the actual measure structure, the time signature of the music really does heavily influence your mapping in many ways. For example, we don't see a whole lot of pentagons because pentagons don't really represent. And same thing with like hexagons. You don't see a whole lot of really obvious hexagons because, a grouping of 6 doesn't really work very well in a grouping of when the song is grouped into 4s, right? So that's why triangles and squares are so effective because squares are a grouping of 4, right? Easy. And triangles are a grouping of 3 plus 1, which that plus 1 is that C, right? Coming back to that song structure idea. So that's why triangles are so widely adopted. And then, of course, you have the 1-2s, which are groupings of 2, which are just a division of 4. So it all really comes down to the song structure, why certain mapping choices are used more than others. That's why you don't see a whole lot of pentagons. You don't see a whole lot of hexagons, and so on and so forth. Because it doesn't work as well in terms of the song structure, and sometimes you can pull it off, but in many cases not so much. So anyway, we're in the second or the third hypermeasure. This is the repeat of the A, but it's a little different with this screaming going on, and so the change, the variation here. Because you don't want to repeat the exact same hypermeasure as before, because a hypermeasure is a larger structure in the song, right? It would get kind of repetitive if you repeated it exactly. So to represent that change, that screaming vocal, right, you got to highlight what changes in the song to create that contrast. The SV and spacing generally increases, right? So there's some changes there. So some of the SVs and stuff are bigger. So on and so forth. In this case, the spacing of the constant spacing thing here, this is a repeat of that first idea. It's much bigger. It's no longer small spaced, it's big spaced, right? So it's the same idea, but because of the screaming increasing the overall intensity of the section, this is how Undead Capulet was sort of trying to capture that. So... and there you go. Again, right there. And this is that outro. So this is the end. And so it's going to be different, transitioning us into the next verse. So... I didn't really explain point out individually the measures of, I didn't break it down there. But if you apply what I talked about and taught you in the first part of the chorus, the first 2 hypermeasures, you should very easily be able to apply it to the next 2 hypermeasures in the second part of the chorus, with the understanding that it's a little different because of the streaming, right? The element of the song being different. Now, it's not always, of course, going to be so clear-cut, and there's certainly room, depending on who you are. Undead Capulet is a mapper that very strictly, it's by the book, right? You follow the song structure. There's really no exceptions. The vast majority of mappers take a much more lenient approach to this, right? It's not saying that you have to... this song structure doesn't support me doing something different. If you want to do something different, by all means, go ahead. But considering the song structure here in sort of this kind of manner really helps to inform those decisions. For example, if you have a choice between variating in measure B or measure A, well, it makes more sense to variate it to create that variation in measure B, because that matches the song structure more closely, right? So you can apply that kind of concept. Or if you're trying to figure out, oh, does repetition make sense here? Well, is the song structure supporting repetition, or is the song structure indicating that perhaps this is not supposed to be the same thing? And if it is supposed to be the same thing, when can you introduce that variation? Well, in the next change in the song. The next hypermeasure is usually a good spot for that. And then the idea of emphasizing your transitionary phrases is a really important one as well, right? Those transition phrases are really important shifts in the song that you need to highlight. You really need to ideally lead into your next idea with those, which in this case, this transition phrase here with the longer held repeat sliders helps transition us into the calmer after chorus, like calmer verse after the chorus. So, and then we head on it over here. I don't know if there's anything else in particular that I really want to highlight, because, like I said, the actual specific shapes, like why did they do this rent anchor here, that's not important. That's not relevant. The other choices, like how they use parallelism here, those are used consistently in the appropriate spots in each chorus or each measure. So if you look at measure A and then you look at the next measure A, they use the same like parallel idea in the exact same spot within them. So it's like almost copy pasting the concepts. It literally is copy pasting the ideas, the core ideas across everything, but none of the actual patterns are exactly the same. None of the shapes are the same at all. So it really, it's a structured chaos, if you will, right? Which is a really cool aspect. So, anyway. So, because the SV is so high, and this is one of the reasons that the circle size is so low, is because the SV being high forces your spacing to be big in order to have a spacing that matches the SV effectively. Otherwise, your map becomes really awkward to play. So because the SV is high, and it kind of has to be high because there's a lot of held sliders, otherwise it wouldn't be very intense. It uses a big spacing, and so it uses a high circle size or a low circle size to make the aim requirement easier, to make the map not 20 million stars in difficulty. It's only 6.5 or whatever it is. So these choices are used very intentionally. The higher circle, the lower circle CS also helps create this more claustrophobic, cluttered feeling because more of the playfield is overlapping. More of these objects are overlapping. So all these things play into it. But because the every jump basically is cross screen, like every single jump is basically cross screen, right? Because the spacing needs. This creates a really prominent sort of, you're flying from one corner of the screen to the other, just back and forth over the center of the playfield, right? So like if you look at my cursor, it is constantly moving from one side to the other of the playfield. And we're shifting here to now we're staying in sort of one part, right? This is sort of introducing a change, that change in dichotomy from moving from one side to the other side, constantly slicing through the center of the playfield. Now we're sort of staying a little bit more on one side. And that culminates here where we go back and we introduce this idea that we had over here, right? We expand on this idea from this one where it's low spacing. Now it's back here, okay? So low spacing, you're moving around the outside of the playfield, right? You're no longer in the center of the playfield like you were in the chorus. You're jumping around. It's very intense, very chaotic. It's now moving around the outside of the playfield. The other aspect is that this is a really significant intensity change. You come out of the chorus exhausted. You're beat. It's very chaotic, very intense. There's not really a whole lot of breaks. It's The sliders are ugly, you know, they're very chaotic, right? And so now we're in this calm section. There's no sliders. It's nice and calm. It's pretty, you know, we're just moving around. We're chilling. We're vibing. It's a really satisfying release of that tension, where the player can finally have that moment of reprieve, right? And every map kind of does this subconsciously, but notice that how intentional it is, right? You're moving around the outside of the playfield, which is the exact opposite of what you were doing in the chorus, which enhances that contrast, right? This is about as polar opposite as you can get in terms of mapping. And there's, you know, this back and forth, and this back happens. This is that transition into the next measure, right? So we go back on each measure, emphasizing each measure with sort of backtracking. Now this backtracking idea becomes more prominent as we go on. The triple here signals the change. We're going into the next hypermeasure of the verse. So this hypermeasure idea is so critical, right? This triple is was not there before, but we're signaling that there's a change here. So, and this change is now that the density increases so much, right? So now it's much more chaotic, but the general concept of, you know, flowing around the outside of the playfield still applies, right? It's more developed, or it's more intense as the verse, you know, it's a build-up as it builds up. And there's a little bit more back and forth, right? This back and forth helps to introduce this a little bit of unease or discomfort back into the map, right? So as the verse progresses into the second hypermeasure, it becomes a little bit more uncomfortable, a little bit more discomforting. And so it definitely becomes more cluttered visually, right? And that visual clutter helps to enhance the discomfort. So we're moving around. And then this here is the, you know, specifically right here. Yeah. So like right here, this is that transition phrase, that C, the fourth measure of the hypermeasure, of this hypermeasure. So, and like I said, this is the really significant measure, because that transition, it needs to probably do something. It almost always needs to do something different in order to contrast. So in this case, instead of moving around the outside of the playfield, notice here that it shifts, right? Instead of moving around the outside of the playfield, we kind of get stuck down here. And actually, I misidentified it. It's actually supposed to be this one. This one is that fourth hypermeasure. I miscounted. So this is that fourth hypermeasure. This is that measure C. So this one's stuck down here, right? So it moves over here and then gets stuck on measure C. So that transition phrase, right? We change the norm. We contrast. Instead of moving around the playfield nice and calmly, we get compressed and compressed and compressed into the corner of the map as this, you know, progressively becomes more uncomfortable, more discomforting, you know, more back and forth, more overlaps, that kind of thing. And then, you know, getting stuck down here in the corner, right? Which is, again, the exact opposite of the whole concept of moving around the playfield freely, right? We're no longer moving around the playfield freely. We're stuck in the corner. And then it releases that tension right here, right? So now we're moving around the playfield nice and freely, right? Again. And this was exactly the same idea as over here, where it got stuck down here at the bottom of the playfield, and then you get that release right here. This one wasn't as long, though, right? Remember that? This was only one measure, or one hypermeasure, instead of two, to have that build up. So we get that release, moving around the playfield, very happy and carefree, and, you know, it brings back the idea of moving up the playfield diagonally here, right into the top corner. Like I said, Undead Capulet finds this to be the most significant and emotionally impactful spot on the playfield. and then repeating the same ideas as the first one. So this course, I'm not really going to get into this course too much, because this course is going to be almost exactly all the ideas carry over exactly from the first chorus to the second chorus. So I'm not going to get too much into that. What I want to really highlight, though, and this was an analogy that I use for this section here, and to really contrast it, and to really make it clear why this part in particular, because this part here is my favorite part in the map, for sure. And the reason for that, I use this analogy, and I don't remember if it was on Dead Capulet that gave it to me, or if it was my own. Pretty sure it was on Dead Capulet's own idea. Either way, I run all of this by Undead Capulet, and this is 100% their intention when they do it. Is that when you come out of this, you're tired, you're exhausted, you're drained, and you finally getting that release, that break, right? So you're very happy. This is a very calm verse. Not a ton of density here, as you know. You're just walking along pretty calmly, right? You're like strolling through a forest, and it gets a little more comfortable here. You're getting to the, maybe an unsafe part of the forest, a little uneasiness. And then, you come along, and it becomes denser. As you know, right, the sense of unease is building, and what you end up finding yourself is you're trapped. You get trapped down here, which is uneasy, right? And I like to analogize this to like a bird getting trapped in a cage, right? Up until this point, you were a bird flying around your room very happily out in the wild, and slowly you've been corralled, guided, and gotten trapped into this cage here, this bird cage. And so you're like, oh, what the hell? I want to get out. And so this is a really, really powerful tension building element. And then you get finally spread your wings again right here, right? Finally spreading your wings. So the bird is super, super happy. And that bird is you. You get to fly up to the sun, right? Icarus, don't burn. So that's why this felt really, really powerful, because like that was very clear to me, right? In terms of that feeling of that bird getting trapped in the cage and then being released, I think is very analogous to the feeling that you get when you're playing the map there. That was a very rambly way of getting to that point. So anyway, I apologize for that. Hopefully that makes sense. Anyway, like I said with this one, second chorus is the same idea as the first. Think about the hypermeasure structure and how the spacing interacts, right? You have big spacing at this spot, to this spot, to this spot. Like all the spacings that are used are one-to-one across it. With some, again, random slider shapes as they desire for some flair, right? The dividing line between the first or the second hypermeasure and the third hypermeasure as the intense vocals come in the background there. So like even though the slider, the rhythm that was used was for the drum that exists here, the SV that was used and the shape that was used is for the vocal. So repeating ideas. So this one's a little different because it's not. I mean, this verse here is not the same. It's actually serving as the bridge of the song, but it carries the idea of those repeating sliders that were introduced earlier. But notice that it's not following the vocals; it's following the drums. And then we have our final chorus. And the final chorus is going to be the most intense because and that makes sense for progression-wise. The third chorus is almost always the most intense in any song, as you have that progression between every chorus. And it's also just good video game design, right? It's like level design, right? You want this progressive build-up and difficulty as you progress. You don't want the hardest boss at the very beginning. And you don't want every boss in the game to be equal difficulty, right? That doesn't really serve well. The song has spent this entire time building up to this moment, and it deserves that payoff in the map. So higher SV results in higher spacing. So, cool ideas here, for example, having this overlap, like normally you'd expect it to be over here, but it's actually over there, because it's the end of the song, right? And it ends in the corner of the playfield. So that's exactly, of course, where Undecapulate thinks that is the most impactful, right? And that's the outro, right? So the last chorus is different. Like, it ultimately is different in many ways, but a lot of the ideas from the first two choruses are carried over but modified as appropriate, right? Like instead of this one being a kick slider, it's extended, but you still have that big jump, right? And then like this one, instead of being really small spacing, it's big spacing, right? One of the differences that in the song doesn't actually have triples here anymore, or the whole stream thing. So this one doesn't have the stream. And the stream is here this time. But it's not in the same dividing hypermeasure 2 and 3 in this spot anymore. It doesn't divide those two hypermeasures. It's in a different spot entirely, so it doesn't have the same cross-screen spacing that the previous one does, because it doesn't serve the same purpose in dividing those hypermeasures. So that's that. Is there anything else that I feel I need to mention? So I talked about like song structure, and sort of recapping here. We talked about song structure and how really significant that is in this map. How it uses the transitions to justify changes. How it uses the structure of measures and hypermeasures to inform consistency, but also variation, right? This is what I think is so incredible that a lot of people don't realize, that this map takes consistency to such an extreme that most mappers would find it uncomfortably consistent, right? They would get bored mapping this way in any other style. Undead Capulet does not take any like liberties when it comes to consistency. There's no like, I just feel like it. None of that. It's but because it's so ugly looking on the surface, a lot of people don't realize that. And the consistency is done in such a way that most people wouldn't care. Like most people don't care that you have the same spacing in the same spots. Most people don't care. Most people don't care that you use the same rhythms in the exact same spots, to this degree at the very least. So it's a really interesting idea, a really interesting approach. Um, mm, and if you really want to, you can go and if you don't really believe me, uh, go look at the green lines. My recording software is not set up to show the green lines, but go look at the green lines and you'll see the similarities across every section and how in the same spots in each measure or each chorus, in each paired measure, you're gonna have the exact same SVs and the exact same changes in SV. Yeah, it becomes pretty obvious if you look at the green lines as well. Um, and then we talked about using the contrast and using things like movement, but also like the visual structure and things like that to create that emotional imagery, if you will, right? The imagery of the bird getting trapped in the cage. Of you becoming discomforted in a forest or whatever it is, right? You become tired, and then you become more gullible in some ways, right? Um, so this map uses that, and what I like is that it actually introduces that concept here, and then it pays it off here, and it expands on it there. Um, so in many of my maps, I've used this idea of trapping the player to build tension and then releasing it as a form of emphasis. I've used it many times in my maps. Maybe not to the same degree. Like this one is like a very, from the beginning it was planned. That contrast between the verse and the chorus is very planned. But let's see if I can find an example in my maps, right? Let's see. I don't think this one has it. This one kind of has it, where in this part of the map, I stay at the bottom of the playfield, because I find the bottom to be, to me, it's like sort of lower intensity, so staying relatively low on the playfield helps to improve the contrast. Moving on to the next section. And then, repeating here. So kind of trapping you in the same spot, and then going to a different spot. It's a small idea here, but it's sort of the same idea, just applied in a smaller way. It's not like sectional based necessarily, but it's, my idea for this measure in this case was, if you keep going back to the same spot, in that repetition, and then you can go to someplace new, it's a little bit more of a payoff there. And then I end up in the center of the playfield because, in many cases, I find the center to be the most impactful visually. So ending up in the center is nice. And then going up to the corner, you are in the center. So the thing you're not expecting is to have to jump to the corner. Bam. So it's sort of plays contrary to your expectations, which makes it more emphasized. And then in this case, using rotation, but it's very cluttered rotation, right? You're using rotation here, staying in one spot for the held vocal, right? Going back in on itself here was done because it's sort of all one phrase. In this case, it's not all one phrase, it's sort of separate vocal phrases, and so I allow the player to move to a new part of the screen that they haven't been to in a while, in a pattern that's not as cluttered, right? Same thing here, right? In this case, the vocal is held, there's this constant guitar thing, So I represented that by keeping the player in one spot. It allows you to create really cool contrasts with rhythms as well, right? So instead of having a really dense rhythm, I have a really sparse rhythm for this that uses all the corners, right? Instead of going and moving around the playfield, we just jump from one corner to the other. Because I've used the corners, I can then use the center of the playfield because it hasn't been used. So now the center of the playfield is opened up for sort of the focal point, emphasizing this next pattern. So for the guitar and sort of the vocals, I kept it in one spot, coming down to the bottom corner and then releasing it. So as like the pitch rises, the way I was representing or highlighting this pitch or emphasizing it was by putting the player in the bottom corner, like working your way down to the corner, and then letting you come free of that, right? So the way that the pitch was being emphasized in that way. Sort of same idea here. As the pitch decreases, I come down to the corner and it gets cluttered. And then as the guitar comes up, I let you come out of that. Using a big actually thing I use in this one that I in part took from Close to You was the visual contrast, right? The sort of overall design. In the choruses, I represented the intensity, the emotional intensity of the vocals, and the chaos of the guitar with these very chaotic, ugly looking patterns, right? There's lots of overlaps. I don't use consistent rotations. I just sort of hand place everything, right? So it's very ugly looking compared to other parts of the map. But then you look at like parts like this, which are that don't have it, or like you have this part here, which is much calmer. Like straight lines, it's nice, right? And this part, you know, you have these sort of random rotations, random angles. Like I didn't copy paste these sliders, I hand placed them. All right, it's more chaotic feeling here because it's not linear moving; it's sharp angles. And this part here, this part is calm. It's smooth. The vocals. It's not really. It's not the height of the emotional intensity of the song. So aesthetically, I think this section looks nice, right? I kept it very sort of basic. And then I use some patterns like this. Like this is more visually striking. It stands out more. It's the movement wise, it is much more jagged and jarring. And that's because of that uncomfortable, like the weird shift in the guitar here. Sort of almost like out of tune or whatever. And then I use, with the added guitar, instead of keeping that same smooth movement, I use a bit more of like sudden changes in movement to highlight the discomforting aspect of this guitar being added. And notice here that I use a grouping of 4, right? So, and actually it's a little bit awkward here, but there's a grouping of 4. So like a big square, effectively. I guess it's not really a good example. Yeah, excuse me. Okay, moving on. Undermapping this part. Dividing the screen in half. That transition. So these sliders here are transitionary, which is why they're NC'd like this, but they transition into the next hypermeasure. Same thing here. These are transitionary. This part here had the like the funny guitar thing going on, the strumming. And so in this case, I used more cluttered patterning. I used more sharp movements. It's not smooth anymore. Getting cluttered in the center here. And then letting you out. And, things like going down into the corner and then jumping to the other side of the screen for sort of a playfield usage emphasis. This one's absolutely something that I did a playfield gimmick where as the pitch rises, the spacing increases, and then as the pitch decreases, it becomes smaller, but it also becomes more cluttered, right? I let it play into itself. So I go up the playfield for the rise in intensity, the rise in pitch, and then down it for as the pitch decreases, while also lowering the spacing, while also kind of bunching these things together. And then for that transition part of it, instead of going in more in on itself, I break out of that, continuing it downwards. Slider shape design is generally fairly straightforward, straight slider. So when I did something like this, it's a cute little detail. It stands out a little bit. It doesn't affect the playing experience at all, but visually it stands out a little bit more because I haven't used unusual shapes like this, especially in the more clean sections, like what I had before, like over here, the cleaner sections. So. So a lot of times, like, my movement choices are based on how I feel the vocal is. If the vocal is really intense or uncomfortable, there's that. And so, of course, this is going to be a repeat of the first one. I used the idea of dividing the screen, actually. So this is that whole, remember the space stream in Close to You? This is that same idea where I divide the screen for this transition phrase. And sort of the same thing here a little bit. You know, cutting the playfield in half, I think, is a really cool playfield emphasis. Repeating from the first one. Ending in a corner, like starting in a corner, ending in a corner, emphasizing it that way. For the guitar and held vocal, right? The guitar is like sort of strumming, it's chaotic. The vocal is held. So I represent that with a constant rotation that is kind of bunched together. But in this case, because it's the last chorus, and I want to emphasize it more, I have it expanding outwards. This one actually had moving around the outside of the playfield, similar to the verse in Undid Capulet's map, Close to You, where it was moving around the outside of the playfield. In this case, I move around the outside of the playfield, and then move up through the center of it. So I sort of open up the space, and I fill it in here. And this is something that a lot of mappers use. I did it because having this empty space here, and then sort of sandwiching it in with the stuff you did around it, helps make this part stand out more. And it's also, of course, the movement is much more chaotic compared to what is over here. This part was hard to map because the rhythm is hard in this one to like figure out exactly. But I used the ideas of following the song structure really heavily here. So basically what I did was I figured out what I wanted to do for one hyper measure, or like one measure, and I copied it over to measure B, right? So you have this, and like, yeah, I have this here, right? Just transitioning into, and you can see this wide movement idea, transition into the next, in this case, like then sort of the next, next measure A, effectively. And this is really that transition into the next hyper measure. And then you have like this wide movement idea here. Transitionary phrase, which is why this one's the end seed one. This one's end seed because it's the transition to the next hyper measure, where it repeats exactly from the first hyper measure, right? So this is like the second hyper measure, measure A again. So, you know, 1-1 slider with the long gap, right? And jump. In this case, one's a little different because the guitar is strumming a little harder, so I made this triple instead of a repeat. And the density increases for the build-up as the guitar is really crazy. As you can see, the playfield is sort of getting... it's moving around the playfield a lot, but in some cases it gets a little cluttered, like stuff like this. Like here, kind of getting cluttered a little bit. Moving from this corner over to this corner, and then it gets stuck up here for a little bit. Like this is sort of like trapping you into a corner and then letting you release it. Especially because this part is going to feel more open, so I wanted to create a little bit more of a cluttered feeling here, leading into the more open feeling section here. This section doesn't use the straight lines because it, you know, is a little different. This one is justified in being different because it's the transition into the next hypermeasure, right? So I use the hypermeasure idea, that transition phrase, very significantly to justify, oh yeah, I mean, yeah, the rhythm is different, but it's different because it's in the song structure that is different. And then I repeat from the first one. So now we've looked at like basically two maps now. And as you saw in my map, I didn't quite take it to the same degree that Undead Capulet did, right? But hopefully what you saw was that those concepts that are in Undead Capulet's map can be applied into other maps in meaningful and interesting ways that hopefully will create a much more engaging and emotional experience. Like, I think I did a pretty good job making each section for the player feel the way that the song feels to me in this map, in my map here. And I think Undead Capulet did a fantastic job translating their vision for the song into a mappable experience, a playable experience. Whether or not it pays off the same way as for you as it did for me, I can't control that, but I hope it does. And I hope that you're able to use some of these ideas that even Charles 445, who a lot of people respect, had the similar ideas, right? This whole idea of emotional responses. That's really ultimately what this comes down to, is that emotional response, and how do we create that emotional response? Well, using some of these techniques is a really effective way of doing that. So, okay, anyway, very ranty. I have no idea if any of this made sense, but please let me know your thoughts in the comments, or send me a message or whatever. I'm certainly not hard to contact, and if you think that I am, I don't really know what to tell you. My direct messages are open in Discord. You can join the Vocaloid Appreciation Team Discord community. I'm there all the time. You can message me on Osu. My DMs are open as long as you share a shared server with me. and I'm in most of the major mapping servers. Only reason that my DMs are not open to everyone is because I have a very unique tag that people really want, so I get a lot of spam for it. So, yeah. Anyway, I'm curious what people think and if I should do more of these. And have a good one.